Incompetence does not breed confidence. Ignorance does. The absolute certainty you feel when entering a completely new domain is a biological lie. It is not an early indicator of your untapped potential. It is a highly specific physiological sedative. Your brain deploys this chemical cocktail for one singular purpose. It must mask the terrifying physical reality of your own sheer incompetence. Without this automated neurological shield, the raw data of your ignorance would induce immediate psychological collapse. Your nervous system literally alters your perception of reality to maintain baseline functioning. You feel invincible precisely because you know absolutely nothing. Watch closely how they react in the wild. Observe a novice investor explaining cryptocurrency to a peer across a coffee shop table. They lean their torso heavily forward. They actively consume physical space to establish spatial dominance. Notice their vocal pitch drops significantly to project an artificial acoustic authority. They deploy rigid, downward, chopping hand gestures. Every physical movement is synchronized to punctuate mathematically impossible statements. They guarantee the asset will bounce back. Their respiratory rate remains perfectly slow and steady. There is zero physiological stress hormone coursing through their bloodstream. Then, they are hit with a highly technical question regarding blockchain hash rates. The actual fatal mechanism is about to trigger. For less than a fraction of a second, their eyes dart aggressively to the side. This is an involuntary indicator of catastrophic cognitive failure. The brain's processing engine has suddenly stalled upon hitting a data void. To prevent a total systemic panic, they immediately raise their vocal volume. They physically talk over the questioner. They force the conversational trajectory aggressively back to their simplified, rehearsed narrative. But here is the brutal physical reality. Why does the human nervous system actively hallucinate mastery? Why does your own brain intentionally blind you to your most fatal blind spots? It executes this biological deception at the exact millisecond you are structurally most vulnerable to absolute ruin. Beginners do not simply make mistakes. They physically lack the neural architecture required to perceive their own errors. In clinical neurology, there is a severe condition called anosognosia. A stroke patient's left arm is completely paralyzed. Yet, they will calmly and logically insist they can move it perfectly. The brain damage has destroyed the specific neural network responsible for recognizing the paralysis itself. The Dunning-Kruger effect operates on this exact same physical mechanism. Your prefrontal cortex relies on dense synaptic networks to map reality. These networks are built strictly through painful, repetitive experience. When you enter a new domain, those networks simply do not exist. Without that internal physical architecture, your brain cannot simulate the variables of a complex task. It literally cannot register the existence of its own knowledge gaps. But the human nervous system processes ambiguity as a primal survival threat. Facing extreme uncertainty directly triggers your amygdala. It begins to flood your bloodstream with cortisol and stress hormones. To prevent a systemic biological panic, your brain forces a hard override. It rapidly constructs a hyper-simplified, completely false model of reality. You boldly declare that you know exactly how this complex system works. This absolute assertion immediately triggers a massive release of dopamine. The chemical rush instantly neutralizes the physiological stress of the unknown. You are being chemically sedated by your own false certainty. The actual fatal mechanism happens when you face a computationally heavy problem. A low information brain cannot process multi-layered strategic variables. So, it subconsciously swaps the complex question for an elementary one. Instead of analyzing the deep structural mechanics of a project, your brain asks a different question. It asks, does this look physically easy to do? It then generates an overwhelming confidence metric based entirely on that substituted, irrelevant question. Watch a junior employee volunteer to design a highly complex user interface. They have absolutely zero coding or systems design background. They eagerly nod their head up and down during the executive briefing. Their facial muscles are completely relaxed. They exhibit a slight asymmetrical smirk of anticipation. They sit at their desk and rapidly type out a few basic visual outlines. They utterly fail to notice the devastating structural back-end requirements. Their physical posture radiates extreme ease. They are actively walking into a catastrophic project failure with absolute maximum velocity. This is a total clinical severance from objective reality. The individual executes high-stakes decisions with absolutely zero internal warning signals. A devastating collision is mathematically inevitable. But this neurological glitch does not stay isolated inside a single human skull. When this biological delusion enters a corporate social hierarchy, the dynamics shift. It immediately becomes an aggressively contagious pathogen. Human social structures do not reward truth. They are evolutionarily hardwired to reward the biological markers of absolute certainty. Corporate hierarchies systematically prioritize the physical posture of false confidence. They actively punish the nuanced hesitation of genuine expertise. This is not a corporate flaw. It is a primitive biological imperative. In primate social hierarchies, projecting absolute certainty is a mechanical tool. It is the primary mechanism for asserting physical dominance over a group. The observer's nervous system instinctively scans for specific physiological cues. They lock onto individuals exhibiting low cortisol levels and relaxed vocal cords. They instinctively defer to sustained, unblinking eye contact. The human brain processes these physical stress responses as direct proxies for competence. It completely bypasses any logical verification of factual accuracy. The loudest, most relaxed primate is automatically granted unquestioned authority. The actual fatal mechanism triggers when this loud incompetence is socially rewarded. A promotion or public praise acts as a structural reinforcement. It immediately creates a deeply hostile environment for empirical accuracy. The genuine expert sits in the same room. Their prefrontal cortex actively observes this corrupt reward structure. It rapidly calculates a devastating survival metric. It determines that presenting a nuanced probabilistic truth is a severe social liability. This acute threat detection triggers an involuntary behavioral inhibition. The expert's nervous system physically forces them into total silence to protect their social standing. The observer's brain is fundamentally, cognitively lazy. It refuses to expend the massive metabolic energy required to audit technical claims. When a confident speaker makes an assertion, the audience relies entirely on an effect heuristic. They feel the raw emotional resonance of the speaker's physical assertiveness. They chemically conflate that aggressive emotion with empirical, mathematical validity. Loudness is systematically processed as physical proof. Charisma is actively hallucinated as actual competence. Watch a middle manager pitching an entirely unfeasible quarterly timeline. They stand up abruptly inside the sterile boardroom. They place both palms completely flat on the solid mahogany table. They forcefully dominate the physical spatial environment of the room. They deliver the impossible timeline without a single respiratory pause. They purposefully eliminate every filler word from their vocal delivery. Directly across from them sits the senior systems engineer. The engineer possesses the exact data, proving the timeline is structurally impossible. Watch closely how they react. The engineer exhibits immediate micro-withdrawing behaviors. They fold their arms tightly across their chest to physically shield their vital organs. They abruptly shift their gaze downward, staring directly at their notebook. They subtly tighten their orbicularis oris muscle. Their lips press firmly together until the blood drains from the tissue. They are actively, physically suppressing the biological urge to speak. They willingly allow a fatal data error to pass strictly to avoid social friction. This sequence guarantees the permanent institutionalization of sheer incompetence. Massive projects systematically and predictably fail. Critical, life-saving data points are violently suffocated in plain sight. They are crushed entirely by the sheer social dominance of the most uninformed voice in the room. But here is the brutal physical reality. If localized physical boardrooms are this easily corrupted by vocal certainty, the damage is still contained. The destruction becomes absolute when this exact physiological vulnerability scales. It becomes terminal when this biological glitch is actively weaponized by global algorithms. The modern digital information ecosystem is not broken. It is functioning exactly as it was engineered to function. It is a machine deliberately built to exploit this exact biological vulnerability. It mathematically accelerates the spread of absolutist, unverified claims. It systematically and intentionally suppresses nuanced expertise. Algorithms do not optimize for truth. They optimize exclusively for physiological arousal. Absolute. Aggressive statements act as direct biological triggers. They instantly activate the user's sympathetic nervous system. They force the body into a localized state of fight or flight. Nuanced, expert analysis completely fails this mechanical metric. Stating that a problem is highly contextual does not elevate the heart rate. It completely fails to induce pupil dilation. Therefore, the algorithm immediately suppresses the factual data due to a strict lack of bioengagement. The actual fatal mechanism occurs the moment false confidence is published online. The published claim instantly fuses with the user's biological ego. When a credentialed expert presents contradictory data, a severe neurological malfunction happens. The user's brain does not process this as new information. It processes the factual correction as a literal physical threat to its survival. This triggers an immediate, massive cortisol spike. It induces a biological defense mechanism known as the backfire effect. The user violently and aggressively doubles down on their own ignorance. They must defend their neural identity at all costs, even if it defies mathematical reality. These digital echo chambers actively hijack the medial prefrontal cortex. This is the exact brain region responsible for primitive social conformity. A user sees a completely flawed, dangerous claim. They see it reinforced by tens of thousands of digital likes. The brain completely bypasses logical verification. It registers those digital metrics as empirical, physical evidence. This permanently overrides the individual's capacity for independent critical thinking. Rational analysis is physically deactivated by the illusion of consensus. Watch a user mindlessly scrolling a social feed in a dark room. They encounter a highly contrarian, completely unverified medical claim. Their pupils instantly dilate, experiencing a massive dopamine hit of novelty. They do not hesitate to verify the source. They immediately strike the share button. Minutes later, a verified medical professional replies to the thread. The doctor provides a direct peer-reviewed scientific correction. Watch closely how the user reacts. Their breathing instantly becomes shallow and rapid. Their masseter muscle tightens as their jaw visibly clenches. They do not click the linked scientific study. Instead, their thumbs rapidly and violently strike the glass screen. They type a heavily capitalized ad hominem attack against the expert. They are desperately seeking dopamine restoration through pure digital aggression. This is the terminal stage of the cycle. It is the total collapse of a shared epistemic reality. Objective societal truth is entirely replaced. We are left only with tribal, high-decibel delusions. These biological delusions spread mathematically faster than factual correction is physically possible. But here is the brutal physical reality. Escaping this biological and algorithmic trap is not a matter of simply learning more data. It requires a much darker, mechanical process. It requires subjecting your own brain to a highly specific, agonizing form of cognitive trauma. Transitioning from the biological delusion of the beginner is not a psychological shift. It requires enduring a brutal physical deconstruction of your own ego. You must enter a highly specific, agonizing state known as the Valley of Despair. Here, you experience acute metacognitive shock. The realization of the sheer vastness of your own ignorance shatters your previous dopaminergic illusion. This violent shift induces severe cognitive dissonance. It manifests immediately as acute psychological distress and elevated anxiety. Your biological sense of self-worth actively plunges. Your brain's faulty schema of the world is forcefully collapsing in real time. Genuine learning is not a passive experience. It is a violently metabolically expensive physical process. It demands the physical formation of entirely new synaptic connections. It requires the painful overwriting of deeply entrenched neural heuristics. This is an extremely calorie-dense biological procedure. Your brain naturally and aggressively resists this massive energy drain. This biological resistance manifests behaviorally as intense frustration. It triggers involuntary procrastination and severe physical exhaustion during deep study, but the actual fatal mechanism triggers deep within your frontal lobe. Your anterior cingulate cortex is the brain's mechanical error detection center. As your metacognition develops, this specific region becomes violently hyper-active. It constantly flashes internal neurological error signals. You become painfully, obsessively aware of every single micro-mistake you execute. This relentless internal auditing drastically lowers your perceived confidence. Simultaneously, it mathematically increases your actual precision. Watch a medical resident reviewing a misdiagnosis. They have just completed an exhausting clinical shift. They sit completely alone under harsh, sterile fluorescent lights. Their physical posture is completely slumped forward against the desk. This indicates absolute parasympathetic dominance and physical defeat. They rub their temples firmly with their index fingertips. They are physically attempting to soothe a severe tension headache. This pain is directly induced by extreme cognitive load and metabolic strain. They stare completely blankly at the physical patient chart. They murmur to themselves, "I didn't even know I was supposed to look for that marker." Observe their drastically slowed blink rate. Their brain is physically, painfully overwriting a fatal diagnostic heuristic in real time. This is a temporary, but severe manifestation of clinical imposter syndrome. Paradoxically, this agonizing doubt is your most vital biological marker. It is the very first physical proof that your brain is finally processing reality accurately. Surviving this brutal physiological gauntlet is not optional. It is the absolute only mechanism to forge true intellectual resilience. It is the final mandatory sequence to reach the ultimate stage of cognitive evolution. Confidence is absolutely not a metric of objective truth. It is merely a biological sedative designed to keep your nervous system functioning. True expertise looks entirely different on a physiological level. It is a chronic, low-grade state of calibrated physical discomfort. The most lethal intellectual minds do not possess a flawless, high-resolution map of reality. They have simply mastered the brutal physics of navigating extreme uncertainty. They view acknowledging their own ignorance not as a social weakness, but as a mechanical advantage. It is the absolute highest form of intellectual lethality. It physically strips away the biological ego from the cognitive process. This allows the brain's raw processing power to pass incoming data without emotional distortion. The actual survival mechanism requires active, physical intervention. Before initiating any major project or locking in a strong opinion, you must stop completely. Take a physical pen and a blank piece of paper. Write down a highly detailed, chronological scenario where you have failed completely and catastrophically. Document exactly how the internal structure collapsed. You must forcefully compel your brain to simulate the precise mechanics of this failure. This artificial simulation actively suppresses your natural, dangerous biological optimism bias. It forces your prefrontal cortex to process the cold statistical probability of your own ruin. Next, you must build a physical architecture for relentless accountability. You must construct and maintain a strict physical error log. Keep a written ledger documenting your exact predictions against the actual mathematical outcomes. Do not rely on your internal memory. Your memory will automatically and biologically edit the past to protect your ego. You must force your anterior cingulate cortex to look directly at its own mathematical failure rate. You are actively mechanically untangling your biological self-worth from your psychological need to be right. You are forcefully training your nervous system to accept being wrong as a completely neutral data point. Finally, you must completely alter your physical speech patterns. You must adopt strict probabilistic linguistics. Eradicate absolute binaries from your entire vocabulary immediately. Never again physically speak the words, "I know exactly how this works." Replace that biological lie with precise, mechanical probability. State out loud, "I am 80% confident based strictly on the current variables." This linguistic shift prevents your fragile ego from biologically attaching itself to a fixed outcome. It completely neutralizes the physiological backfire effect. It allows your brain to execute an immediate, frictionless, the exact millisecond new data arrives. If your ego survived this cognitive teardown, subscribe. We absolutely do not provide the dopamine of comfortable biological illusions here. We provide only the cold, mechanical reality of how your nervous system actually functions. See you in the next deep dive.